This week we're going to continue in Galatians chapter 6. We're going to read verse 3, but I want to read verses 1 and 2 again from last week just to give the context of verse 3. Verse 1, Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Verse 3, For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, then he deceives himself. The reason Paul mentions this here is because he's talking about, what he's getting at is it requires a spirit of humility to be a burden bearer. So we just talked about burden bearers last week, and the reason he's mentioning your perception or your view of yourself is because if you don't have the proper view of yourself, if you're not a humble person, you're not going to serve others. You're going to expect to be served rather than serve. So he wants to address now your view of yourself and your perception of yourself, because he's going to have to deal with the pride issue if you're going to be a burden bearer. So he says, if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. That's really a strong, very strong way of saying that. He's saying, you think you're something, but in the eyes of heaven, you're nothing. I mean, that's just really almost seems rude, very direct. But I love what he's getting at. He's saying there is a type of person, and many of us have either experienced this in our own life or maybe even are experiencing it now, where you have a view of yourself that doesn't necessarily match heaven's view of you. That can be an inflated view or it can be a deflated view. But oftentimes our view of ourself doesn't match heaven's view, heaven's perspective. I've heard somebody say before, there's how you view yourself, there's how others view you, and then there's the real you, and I would say there's heaven's view. There's how you see yourself, how others, and then there's how heaven sees you. There's how God sees you, and that's what matters the most. So our goal should be to align our view of ourselves with how God sees us, no more and no less. But how does God see me? I want to see myself in that exact light, not inflated, not deflated, but exactly how God sees me. In Romans chapter 12, Paul says it a little bit different way, verse 3. He says, For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. And I love this one because of the wording. He says you should not think more highly than you ought to think. In other words, in the mind of God, there is a way that you ought to think about yourself. And my goal is to think that way. I'm not saying I do it perfectly, but I want to think how I ought to think and how God thinks I ought to think. I want to see myself in that light. In other words, when He sees me, it's fully transparent. There's nothing hidden. It's not like Facebook where you put out only the best pictures of yourself, and you had to take, I don't do this, just so everyone knows. But I don't do selfies, but you could tell someone took 35 pictures of themselves before they finally found the one they wanted. They took it from this angle and this angle and this angle to finally put the perfect picture out. Well, God knows everything. He doesn't just see the Facebook version of yourself. He knows what you think about when you're by yourself. He knows the fears you have, the depression, the faults, the weaknesses that you have that everyone else doesn't get to see. So if your view of yourself is who you put out on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, social media site you're on, that's how I want the world to see me, that's how I want to see myself, then you're not lining up with heaven's view. You need to have an accurate understanding of your weaknesses and your faults and your flaws and your humanity, and of your good points and the things you're strong in. It's an accurate, not too focused on the strengths, not too focused on the weaknesses, just an accurate view of yourself. And I think you have people in either side of the ditch on this. They, as Paul said, they think way more highly of themselves than they ought, but I've also met the other person that thinks way too lowly of themselves than they should. They don't have any confidence. They can't look people in the eye when they talk, and they're always beat down and depressed and borderline, in tears because they're just never good enough. Well, that's not right either. That's not heaven's view of you. So you need to have an accurate view of who you are in Christ, who you are with God. Why would a person have an inflated view of themselves? The reason is because they're judging by the wrong criteria. They're judging themselves by things that heaven cares nothing about, and the things that heaven does care about, they're not judging those things at all. So they're judging things like outward appearance, money, status, career, things that heaven doesn't care as much about. Whereas heaven's looking at character, love, fruit of the Spirit, serving others. They go, well, it's okay I'm failing in those areas because I have all these things right. So you have an inflated view of yourself because you're judging yourself by the wrong criteria. Everything we're talking about is it's very helpful and very pertinent in general. Obviously it's very important how we view ourselves, but Paul is talking about it specifically for how it relates to your ability to serve others and bear others' burdens. So I think the New Living Translation is helpful here in translating this verse. The ESV, which we just read, said, "For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself." The New Living Translation says, "If you think you are too important to help someone, you are only fooling yourself. You are not that important." That's just a great way of saying that. You're never too important to help someone. You're never important to stoop and do lowly things that serve other. And we've talked about this, I remember in main service before, about the very act of serving in and of itself is a humbling act. You have to humble yourself and sort of submit yourself to the person you're serving in a way. At church, I've encountered in years, not so much at our church, but in ministries over the years, people that were just not willing to serve in certain areas of ministry because it seemed beneath them for whatever reason. In other words, I've gotten to this level of ministry. I've done these types of things. I've accomplished this type of stuff in the ministry, and so I'm not going to go back and help in the nursery or in the kids or what. I'm kind of past that. That season's over. I did that decades ago, and I'm not going to stoop back down to that. Well, you probably have an inflated view of yourself. You're not seeing yourself the way that God sees you. And you can see how if you have that wrong view, you will not serve properly and you will not bear other people's burdens because you're elevating yourself to a level that you shouldn't be at. Verse 4, "But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor, for each will have to bear his own load." He is talking about two extremely important things here. The first one is this: the need for honest self-evaluation. He says, let each one test himself. Test, examine, look at, in depth, your own work. It's a self-evaluation that he's talking about here. And just to be quite honest, most people do not like to examine themselves. They like to examine others. It's just so much more fun to examine other people and analyze their decisions and what they're doing. It's just not nearly as much fun to examine yourself and to really look at what you're doing and why you're doing it and all those things. But he says, test your own work, test yourself, look at yourself, take the time to really look at what you're doing and why you're doing it. And here are the three areas that we have to look at if you're going to truly examine yourself. Number one, what? What am I doing? Am I doing what I'm doing is in life, my future, my career, my path, anything? What am I doing? Am I doing something that God has asked me to do, or am I doing something that others have told me I need to be doing or should be doing or I would be good at doing? Or am I doing something that I want to do? So number one, if you go to evaluate your life and what he's referring to here, number one, what are you doing? Is it what God's told you to do? Have you asked God about it? Have you sought Him? Do you have confirmation from Him that this is what you should be doing and the direction you should be going? Are you getting that from something else? Did you choose your career because it's going to make good money? Did you choose it because it was convenient? Did you choose it because your advisor told you to? So number one, look at what am I doing? Take the time to do this. And I don't think this is something you can just do in passing. You have to set time aside in prayer with God and ask these questions. What am I doing? What direction am I headed? Because you don't want to get 50, 60, 70 years down the road to answer that question. It's never too late to do something, and make an adjustment. But, if you're that far down the road, it's going to be difficult to make some kind of big life adjustment. It's important to ask yourself, what am I doing? And number two is why? Why am I doing it? Am I doing this for selfish ambition? Am I doing this with the right motives? Are my motives right? Why am I doing it? And number three is how am I doing it? So maybe what you're doing because God's asked you to do it. It's something that God has you doing. Maybe the why of it, the motives are correct. You're doing it because you want to please God, not please self. But the how is important. So you might be doing the what and the why right, but the how is important. How are you accomplishing what God's asked you to do? Are you burning yourself out? Are you burning others out? Are you burning bridges and there's like a wake of people and behind you in relationships that you're just destroying in the process? Because that's not the will of God. Even though you might be doing the will of God, the how part of it could be wrong. It's how you're going about it that's not correct. Or the how could be sin. What you're accomplishing, are you doing it through sin? Are you doing it through lying, stealing, cheating, not paying your taxes, not treating people right? Because you could be doing something God's asked you to do, but the how is totally wrong because you're in sin. When he says take an honest look at yourself, honest need for evaluation, I don't think, it doesn't matter what point in life you're at, it's helpful to pull aside and make sure that you're not just caught up on the hamster wheel doing what you're doing without stopping and going, is this God's call for my life? Am I headed in the right direction? Are my motives right? Am I going about it in a way that's going to make God proud? Am I going about it in a way that when I look back in 10 years, I'm going to be proud of what I've done and how I've handled things? That's the first thing. The first thing that Paul says is that you have to evaluate. You have to take the time to evaluate your own self. Now, the second thing, we're just not going to be able to get into this week. So we're going to have to call this part one, and then part two next week we will get into the second thing that Paul is saying in this verse.